The September air in Millerville, Ohio hung thick with the weight of endings as I stood in Uncle Harold's kitchen, the funeral service barely 3 hours behind us. Golden afternoon light filtered through the gauze curtains my late Aunt Dorothy had sewn 30 years ago, casting everything in that particular amber hue that makes ordinary moments feel suspended in time. The house still carried Harold's presence, pipe tobacco mingled with Old Spice and that faint medicinal smell that had clung to him these past months. It was the kind of smell that settles into your bones and makes you understand that some departures leave echoes that never quite fade. My name is Robert Mitchell, and at 62, I'd buried enough family to know the peculiar silence that follows a funeral. It's different from regular quiet, heavier, more expectant, as if the house itself is holding its breath. I'd volunteered to start going through Harold's things while my cousins Dennis and Patricia handled the funeral reception at the Methodist Church downtown. They'd been gracious about letting me take the first shift, probably because they knew Harold and I had shared something special that went beyond mere family obligation. 25 years working the line at General Motors in Lima had taught me the value of methodical work, and grief, I'd learned, required the same steady approach. You couldn't rush through loss any more than you could rush through properly torquing a bolt. Both demanded patience, precision, and respect for the process. Harold had been more than my uncle. He'd been my mentor, my fishing partner, and the man who taught me that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you carried yourself through life's inevitable storms. When my wife Linda passed from breast cancer 4 years ago, Harold had been the one to sit with me through those long nights when sleep felt like surrender and grief like a weight that might crush your chest. He'd lost Dorothy to a stroke 7 years back, so he understood the particular loneliness that follows losing your life's companion. The silence is the hardest part, he'd told me one evening as we'd sat on his back porch watching fireflies dance over Dorothy's neglected rose garden. It's not just quiet, it's the absence of all the conversations you'll never have. The kitchen felt enormous without his presence filling it. Harold had been a big man, not tall, but solid, with hands like catcher's mitts and a voice that could carry across the factory floor even over the roar of machinery. He'd worked 43 years at the Ford plant before his pension kicked in, and even in retirement, those hands never quite lost their calloused certainty. Dorothy used to joke that he could fix anything except his own stubborn heart, and she wasn't wrong. The man had survived 3 heart attacks through pure ornery determination and what he called spite disguised as hope. Moving through the familiar rooms, memories flickered like old film reels. Summer barbecues where Harold would hold court around his ancient Weber grill, spinning stories about union negotiations while corn silk drifted on the evening breeze. Christmas mornings when Dorothy would orchestrate elaborate gift exchanges while Harold quietly slipped $20 bills into the grandkids' pockets with conspiratorial winks. The way he'd insisted on driving himself to church every Sunday until the very end, even when his arthritis made gripping the steering wheel an act of will that left his knuckles white and trembling. The dining room held its own collection of ghosts. Dorothy's mahogany table still bearing ring stains from countless coffee cups, and the small gouge where Harold's pocket knife had slipped during one of his whittling sessions. China figurines lined the hutch, each positioned exactly as Dorothy had left them, as if Harold couldn't bear to disturb her arrangements even after 7 years of solitude. But it was in Harold's bedroom that I found the note, tucked inside the Bible Dorothy had given him for their 20th anniversary. His handwriting, still firm despite the tremor that had developed in his final months, spelled out words that made something cold settle in my chest. Bobby, look in the mason jar behind the green beans in the cellar. What's there is meant for you. The others don't need to know about everything. Some gifts come with conditions, and this one's condition is wisdom. Use your judgment. H. The cellar smelled of earth and preserves, that particular basement aroma of concrete and stored memories. Harold had built these shelves himself in 1978, after Dorothy had discovered canning during the plant layoffs. Behind a cluster of Dorothy's failed pickled beets sat a single jar wrapped in an old dish towel. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, not from the cellar's chill but from something deeper. Inside, cushioned by cotton batting, lay dental gold. Harold's teeth, removed over his final years, but not just dental work. Solid gold crowns, bridges, even what looked like a gold-plated partial denture. The metal caught the bare bulb's light like captured sunlight. A folded paper beneath read, "Bobby, this is worth about $12,000 at current prices. 3 generations of family gold teeth, including mine. The others would see dollar signs. You'll see what it really is. A legacy that shouldn't be squandered. Trust your heart. Standing in that cellar, jar in my hands, I felt the weight of Harold's trust settling around me like a mantle. Tomorrow my cousins would arrive with their questions and assumptions. Tonight, I held a secret that somehow felt larger than gold. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning after finding Harold's jar dawned gray and unseasonably cool for late September. The kind of weather that makes you reach for a sweater and reminds you that summer's grip on Ohio is always more fragile than it appears. I'd spent the night in Harold's guest room, the same narrow bed where I'd recovered from my appendectomy 20 years ago when Linda was too overwhelmed with her own mother's failing health to properly nurse me back to strength. Sleep had come in fitful waves, interrupted by the house's unfamiliar settling sounds and the weight of Harold's secret pressing against my consciousness like a stone lodged beneath my ribs. Coffee percolated in Dorothy's old aluminum pot while I sat at the kitchen table, watching cardinals flit between the maple trees Harold had planted to shade the breakfast nook. He'd been methodical about those trees, researching soil conditions and spacing with the same precision he'd applied to everything from brake assembly to Dorothy's birthday surprises. "Trees are promises to the future," he'd told me once, his hands dark with earth as we'd positioned the saplings. "You plant them not for yourself, but for the shade your grandchildren will need." That philosophy had defined Harold's entire approach to life. Always thinking ahead, always considering consequences beyond the immediate moment. It's what had made him such a steady presence during the plant's volatile years, when rumors of closures and layoffs swept through the factory floor like seasonal viruses. While other men panicked or drank their fears away, Harold quietly contributed extra to his 401k and learned new skills that would make him indispensable. My cousins Dennis and Patricia represented a different branch of the family tree. Harold's brother's children, raised in the suburbs of Columbus, with advantages Harold and I had never known. Their father, my Uncle Bill, had parlayed his engineering degree into management positions that kept the family comfortable, but somehow disconnected from the blue-collar values Harold embodied. Where Harold saw work as dignity, they saw it as a stepping stone to something better. I remembered the tension at family gatherings when Dennis would arrive in his increasingly expensive cars, regaling Harold with stories about pharmaceutical sales territories and bonus structures that exceeded Harold's annual pension. Patricia wasn't much different, though she expressed her success through designer handbags and casual mentions of country club events. Harold would listen politely, but I'd catch him later in the kitchen, shaking his head with the particular sadness of someone watching family drift away on currents of their own making. "Money changes people," Harold had confided to me during Dorothy's final illness, as we'd sat in the hospital waiting room watching Patricia scroll through her phone instead of holding her dying aunt's hand. "Not having it teaches you what matters. Having too much of it teaches you what doesn't." His words carried no bitterness, only the weary observation of someone who'd watched prosperity hollow out character in people he loved. The memories came flooding back as I moved through Harold's house that morning. Christmas dinners where Dennis would dominate conversation with industry success stories, while Harold quietly carved the turkey and made sure everyone's plate stayed full. Easter Sundays when Patricia would critique Dorothy's decorating choices or suggest updates that would bring the house into this century. The gradual reduction of visits, phone calls that grew shorter and more perfunctory, until Harold's connection to his niece and nephew became largely ceremonial. But there had been good times too, especially when they were younger. I remember Dennis at 15, spending a summer helping Harold rebuild a transmission in the garage, his expensive sneakers gradually acquiring honest oil stains. Patricia at 12, learning to fish from Harold's rowboat on Lake Erie, her patience finally rewarded when she landed her first bass and squealed with delight that had nothing to do with designer labels or social status. Those memories made Harold's current situation more poignant. He'd watched his brother's children achieve the kind of financial success he'd never pursued, yet somewhere along the way, they'd lost touch with the values that had sustained Harold through 43 years of factory work and 38 years of marriage. Success had brought them comfort, but somehow cost them the ability to find meaning in simple things. A well-cooked meal, an afternoon spent fixing something with your hands, the satisfaction of a job completed with integrity. Dorothy had understood this better than anyone. "They're good people," she'd told Harold during one of their quiet kitchen conversations that I'd overheard. "They just measure different things than we do. Doesn't make them wrong, just makes them lonely in ways they don't recognize yet." Her insight had been characteristically gentle, finding compassion for family members who'd grown foreign to their own roots. The jar in the cellar represented something more complex than mere inheritance. Harold's note had been specific about discretion, about using judgment rather than following legal obligations. He understood that Dennis and Patricia would see the gold teeth as assets to be liquidated, their value calculated in current market prices rather than family history. They wouldn't appreciate the significance of 3 generations of dental gold, the Depression-era practicality that had led Harold's grandfather to save even extracted teeth because gold was gold, regardless of its source. That afternoon, I found myself studying the family photographs scattered throughout Harold's house with new attention to detail. Pictures of Harold's father, my grandfather Thomas, showed a thin man with Harold's steady eyes and calloused hands. He'd worked the coal mines in southeastern Ohio until black lung forced an early retirement that poverty made brief. His dental work, according to family stories, had been performed by a dentist who accepted payment in fresh vegetables and occasional labor rather than cash that nobody had during those lean years. Harold's grandfather, the original collector of dental gold, existed only in stories passed down through 2 generations. He'd been a railroad man, back when locomotive engineers were folk heroes and train schedules governed small-town life. The gold teeth had been his hedge against uncertainty, a portable form of wealth that couldn't be lost in bank failures or stolen by desperate neighbors. Each tooth represented not vanity, but survival, extracted by necessity and preserved by wisdom born from hardship. As evening approached, I realized Harold's gift carried obligations that extended beyond monetary value. The gold represented family history, Depression-era resourcefulness, and the kind of practical wisdom that understood precious metals in extracted teeth still counted as precious metals. More importantly, it represented Harold's trust in my judgment about what constituted appropriate stewardship of family legacy. Standing in his kitchen as shadows lengthened across the linoleum floor, I began to understand why Harold had chosen secrecy over legal transparency. Some inheritances couldn't be divided equally because their true value lay not in dollars but in the wisdom required to preserve their meaning across generations. Dennis called that evening while I was sorting through Harold's bedroom dresser, his voice carrying that practiced cheerfulness that had made him successful in pharmaceutical sales, but somehow felt hollow, echoing through Harold's quiet house. "Bobby, I've been thinking about the estate timeline. Patricia and I could have everything organized within 2 weeks if we bring in professionals." Something about his efficiency unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on the source of my discomfort. Harold had been buried less than 48 hours, yet Dennis spoke of dismantling his life with the same casual precision he might use to discuss quarterly sales projections. The funeral flowers were probably still fresh on Harold's grave, and here was his nephew calculating liquidation schedules. "That seems awfully fast," I said, folding one of Harold's flannel shirts and remembering how he'd worn this particular blue plaid to last year's Christmas dinner, spilling gravy on the pocket while telling stories about Dorothy's legendary stuffing recipe. "Time is money in these situations," Dennis replied with the confidence of someone who'd reduced complex human experiences to manageable business principles. "The longer we wait, the more we pay in utilities and maintenance. Plus, Patricia's husband knows an estate sale company in Toledo that could handle everything professionally. They specialize in older homes, know what to look for in terms of hidden value." The phrase hidden value made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't entirely understand. After hanging up, I wandered through Harold's house with growing unease, trying to identify what exactly bothered me about my cousin's approach to handling their uncle's affairs. The practical side of my mind acknowledged Dennis's logic. Empty houses did cost money to maintain, and professional estate sales often recovered more value than amateur efforts. But something deeper protested the speed with which they wanted to erase Harold's presence from the world. In the living room, I studied the photographs covering every surface, Harold's careful documentation of family milestones spanning 50 years, wedding pictures from the 1960s where everyone looked impossibly young and optimistic, birthday parties in this very room where Harold would always position himself slightly outside the main action, content to observe and ensure everyone else felt included, Christmas mornings with grandchildren tearing through wrapping paper while Harold collected the discarded ribbons with Depression-era thrift that never quite left his generation. satisfaction. The next morning brought Patricia's call, her timing so precise, it felt calculated. "Bobby, I drove past the house yesterday evening around 9:30, and I noticed you'd left lights on in several rooms. We should probably be more careful about electricity costs moving forward." Her observation stung more than it should have. After 25 years of managing my own household budget on a factory worker's pension, I hardly needed lectures about utility conservation. But something in her tone suggested this wasn't really about electric bills. It was about establishing oversight, about making sure I understood that even though I was handling the initial sorting, ultimate decisions remained with the official heirs. "I was working late, going through Harold's papers like we discussed," I explained, though her implication that I was somehow careless with their inheritance money left me feeling defensive in ways I didn't appreciate. "Of course, I just meant we should be mindful of unnecessary expenses. Actually, that reminds me, Dennis and I were wondering if you'd come across anything unusual in Harold's belongings. You know, anything that might affect the estate valuation or require special handling." The question hung in the air like smoke from Harold's old pipe, and I found myself gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "Unusual how?" I asked, though my pulse had quickened in response to something I couldn't quite identify. "Oh, you know how Harold was. Always tinkering with things, collecting odds and ends that might have seemed worthless but could actually be valuable. Sometimes elderly people accumulate items without realizing their worth. Old coins, stamps, jewelry that Dorothy might have tucked away and forgotten about. We want to make sure everything's properly documented for tax purposes." Her explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, the kind of thorough approach that responsible heirs should take when settling an estate. But something in her tone, a certain eagerness perhaps, or the way she'd phrased her questions, suggested more than casual concern about tax documentation. I thought about the jar in the cellar, Harold's careful instructions about discretion, his warning that the others would see dollar signs. "Nothing significant so far," I said, the half-truth sliding out more smoothly than felt comfortable. "Just normal household items, bills, insurance papers, that sort of thing." That afternoon, while organizing Harold's workshop in the garage, I found myself paying closer attention to patterns I'd previously dismissed as normal family dynamics. Dennis called again around 3 o'clock, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really to ask more specific questions about what I'd discovered. Had I been through Harold's desk thoroughly? What about Dorothy's jewelry box? Did Harold keep any safe deposit boxes or hidden storage areas that might contain important documents? Each question felt reasonable in isolation, but together they suggested a systematic approach to locating assets that went beyond normal estate settlement procedures. These weren't people casually wondering about their inheritance. They were people actively searching for something specific, though I couldn't determine what exactly they hoped to find. The garage workshop told its own story about Harold's character. Tools hung in precise arrangement on pegboard walls, each outline traced in black marker so every wrench and screwdriver had its designated place. Coffee cans held sorted screws and bolts, labeled in Harold's careful handwriting with descriptions like 3/8 carriage bolts and sheet metal screws, galvanized. This was the workspace of someone who understood that organization wasn't about obsessive control, but about respect for the tools that allowed honest work to get done properly. But searching through those carefully maintained supplies, I began to notice small gaps in Harold's usual precision. A few empty spaces on the pegboard where tools should have hung. Several coffee cans that felt lighter than their labels suggested. Harold had been methodical about maintaining his workshop right up until his final illness, so these absences felt intentional rather than accidental. Evening settled over Millerville with the particular melancholy of early autumn, when daylight begins its retreat and the air carries hints of the winter that's still months away. Sitting in Harold's kitchen with a cup of his bitter coffee, I tried to make sense of the growing tension between my cousin's urgency and Harold's careful instructions about discretion and judgment. The jar waited in the cellar like a test I hadn't yet figured out how to pass. Tomorrow would bring more questions from Dennis and Patricia, more pressure to complete the inventory and move toward liquidation. But tonight, surrounded by Harold's presence in every carefully maintained detail of his home, I found myself wondering if the real inheritance he'd left me wasn't gold at all, but the much more difficult gift of learning to distinguish between what family needed and what family wanted. The following morning brought unseasonably warm weather that made Harold's house feel stuffy and close, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I'd started my day by calling my neighbor Mrs. Henderson back in Lima to check on my own property, but found myself lingering on the phone longer than necessary, reluctant to dive back into the growing complexity of Harold's affairs. Something about my cousin's intensity was making me cautious in ways I couldn't fully explain, like an old factory worker's instinct for sensing when machinery wasn't running quite right. I decided to start with Harold's personal papers more systematically, spreading everything across the dining room table where Dorothy used to lay out her quilting projects. Bank statements, insurance policies, medical bills, and correspondence formed neat piles under the afternoon light filtering through her lace curtains. Harold had been meticulous about record-keeping, probably a habit developed during his union years when proper documentation could mean the difference between a grievance won or lost. What emerged from the papers painted a picture of modest but careful financial management. Harold's checking account showed the steady rhythm of pension deposits and Social Security payments, with withdrawals for utilities, groceries, and medical expenses. Nothing extravagant, but nothing desperate either. He'd lived within his means with the discipline of someone who'd weathered the plant layoffs of the 1980s and understood that financial security came from spending less than you earned, not from earning more than you could spend. But scattered throughout the routine financial documents, I began noticing small anomalies that didn't quite fit Harold's usual patterns. Cash withdrawals of $500 or $600 every few months, always from the same ATM at First National Bank downtown. For a man who rarely carried more than $40 in his wallet and paid most bills by check, these withdrawals seemed oddly large and regular. The timing was consistent too. Always around the middle of the month, always after his pension deposit had cleared. I found myself thinking about Harold's habits during my visits over the past few years. He'd always been generous in quiet ways, slipping $20 bills to grandchildren or insisting on paying for dinner when we'd occasionally meet at the Cracker Barrel, out on Route 30. But these withdrawal amounts suggested something more substantial than casual generosity. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Found a great estate sale company. Can meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. to walk through and provide estimates. Hope that works for your schedule. The message felt more like notification than request, and I found myself irritated by the assumption that I'd simply accommodate their timeline without discussion. Instead of responding immediately, I decided to take a different approach to understanding Harold's recent activities. I drove downtown to Millerville's small business district, parking outside Kroger's Hardware, where Harold had been a regular customer for 30 years. The afternoon was warm enough that I could walk the 3 blocks that comprised the town's commercial heart, past the barber shop where Harold had gotten his hair cut every 2 weeks like clockwork, past the diner where he'd occasionally treated himself to coffee and pie when Dorothy's absence felt particularly heavy. At the hardware store, I struck up a conversation with Tom Kroger, whose father had opened the business in 1952. Tom had taken over in the 1980s and knew every regular customer by name and purchasing habits. Harold was in here pretty regular, he told me, leaning against the counter with the easy familiarity of someone who'd spent 40 years discussing everything from weather to local politics with the same group of men. Always bought quality tools, never the cheap stuff. Said a tool was only as good as the man using it, and he didn't want his tools making him look bad. Did he buy anything unusual in recent months? I asked, trying to sound casual. I'm handling his estate, and I want to make sure I don't overlook anything valuable. Tom thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Couple times this past year he bought some pretty specific items. High-end padlock, the kind you'd use for something important. Heavy-duty metal storage box, waterproof seal. Even asked me about where someone might go to get metal items appraised properly. He paused, studying my expression. Seemed like he was protecting something, you know. Harold wasn't the type to get paranoid without good reason. The conversation left me with more questions than answers. But Tom's observations aligned with the picture emerging from Harold's financial records. The regular cash withdrawals, the protective storage purchases, the inquiries about appraisals. Harold had been preparing for something, though I couldn't determine what exactly required such careful planning. My next stop was the Millerville Library, a Carnegie building that had anchored the town square since 1903. Harold had been a regular visitor, checking out biography and history books with the systematic approach he'd applied to everything else in his life. The librarian, a woman in her 50s named Carol who'd grown up in Harold's neighborhood, remembered him fondly. He was always asking about genealogy resources, she told me as we stood among the reference stacks. Spent hours on the computer looking up family records, ancestry websites, that sort of thing. Said he wanted to make sure important family information didn't get lost when his generation passed on. This detail struck me as significant. Harold had never shown particular interest in genealogy during all the years I'd known him, yet apparently he'd been researching family history with characteristic thoroughness during his final months. Combined with the jar of dental gold and his cryptic note about 3 generations of family teeth, his genealogical research suggested a man trying to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited and what he was preparing to pass on. That evening, I returned to Harold's house with a growing sense that I was uncovering pieces of a puzzle that my cousins either didn't know existed or were deliberately trying to solve without my knowledge. The regular cash withdrawals, the protective storage purchases, the genealogical research, the careful preservation of dental gold. Harold had been building towards something, preparing for a decision that required both financial resources and historical understanding. Sitting in his living room as evening shadows lengthened across the familiar furniture, I tried to imagine Harold during these final months, methodically researching and planning while maintaining the appearance of ordinary retirement routine. He'd been protecting something, but from whom? And why had he chosen to trust me with knowledge that he'd apparently kept hidden from everyone else, including his own niece and nephew? The jar in the cellar suddenly felt less like a simple inheritance and more like the culmination of a carefully executed plan. Harold had been preparing for something that required discretion, judgment, and an understanding of family history that went beyond current market values for precious metals. Tomorrow would bring my cousins and their estate sale professionals, but tonight I found myself wondering if Harold's real gift wasn't gold at all, but the much more complex responsibility of deciding what family legacy actually meant in practical terms. The phone rang as these thoughts were settling into something approaching clarity. Dennis's voice carried a tension I hadn't noticed before. "Bobby, I hope you don't mind, but Patricia and I have been talking to some people about Harold's habits. Seems like he might have been more prepared for the end than we realized. We want to make sure we're handling everything properly." Dennis's words hung in the evening air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate, and I found myself gripping Harold's old rotary phone tighter than necessary. "What kind of people have you been talking to?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach like winter fog. "Just family friends, people who might have insights into Harold's final months," Dennis replied. But his pharmaceutical sales training couldn't quite mask an undertone I'd never heard before, something calculating, almost predatory. Mrs. Kowalski from down the street mentioned that Harold had been asking questions about safety deposit boxes, and the mailman said Harold had been receiving packages from coin dealers and precious metal companies. The methodical nature of their investigation struck me like a physical blow. These weren't casual conversations with concerned neighbors. This was systematic information gathering, the kind of thorough research that suggested they'd been planning this approach well before Harold's funeral. I thought about Patricia driving past the house to check on electricity usage, Dennis's pointed questions about unusual items, their sudden urgency about estate sales and professional appraisals. "Since when do you and Patricia coordinate with the Postal Service about Harold's mail?" I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. Dennis laughed, but the sound carried no warmth. "Bobby, we're all family here. People talk, especially in small towns like Millerville. Harold was getting older, maybe not thinking as clearly as he used to. We just want to make sure he didn't make any decisions that might complicate the estate settlement." The implication that Harold had been mentally compromised made my jaw clench. I'd visited Harold regularly right up until his final hospitalization, and his mind had remained sharp as a tack even as his body failed. He'd been reading technical manuals, completing crossword puzzles in ink, and managing his finances with the same precision he'd maintained for 60 years. If Harold had been secretive about certain activities, it wasn't due to cognitive decline. It was due to judgment about people who might not understand the difference between inheritance and legacy. "Harold's thinking was fine," I said firmly. "Maybe he had reasons for privacy that had nothing to do with mental capacity." Of course, Dennis backpedaled quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest anything negative. It's just that Patricia found some interesting information when she stopped by the bank this afternoon. Apparently, Harold had been making regular inquiries about precious metal storage options and insurance riders for valuable collections." My pulse quickened as I realized how thoroughly they'd been investigating Harold's activities. Banking information, neighbor interviews, postal service inquiries. They'd been conducting their own estate audit parallel to my efforts, but with a focus that suggested they knew something specific they were looking for. "The bank shared Harold's private business with you?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Patricia's been banking there since high school," Dennis explained with practiced smoothness. Karen Williams, the assistant manager, was just making conversation about how sorry they were to lose such a loyal customer. Mentioned that Harold had been asking very detailed questions about storage and insurance options for collectibles. Seemed like he was planning to protect some kind of valuable collection. The pieces were falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. My cousins hadn't just been efficient about estate planning. They'd been conducting their own investigation based on suspicions that Harold possessed valuable items beyond the obvious assets listed in his will and bank statements. The timing of their inquiries, the systematic approach to gathering information, the sudden urgency about professional estate sales, everything suggested they'd been planning this treasure hunt since before Harold died. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of Harold's house seemed amplified. Every shadow appeared to hold significance I couldn't quite grasp. I found myself wandering through rooms I'd known since childhood, seeing them now through the lens of my cousin's suspicious questions and calculated investigation. Had Harold really been as secretive as their research suggested, or had he simply been private about matters that didn't concern anyone beyond immediate family? The next morning brought autumn's first real chill, the kind of weather that makes you understand summer is truly finished and winter is beginning its slow advance across Ohio. I stood in Harold's kitchen drinking coffee and watching leaves drift past the window, thinking about the systematic way Dennis and Patricia had approached their investigation. Banking inquiries, neighbor interviews, postal service questions. They'd been thorough in ways that suggested more than casual curiosity about potential inheritance. My phone buzzed with another text from Patricia. "Estate sale company arriving at 2 p.m. as scheduled. Please have all rooms accessible for evaluation. They'll need to examine everything for proper assessment." Again, the tone felt more like instruction than request, as if my role had been reduced to building superintendent rather than trusted family member handling Harold's affairs. Instead of responding immediately, I decided to conduct my own investigation into my cousin's recent activities. A call to my friend Jerry Kowalski, whose mother lived 3 houses down from Harold, provided interesting insights into their information-gathering methods. "Patricia was pretty direct with Mom yesterday," Jerry told me over the phone. "Asked specific questions about whether Harold had been acting secretive lately, whether he'd mentioned anything about valuable items or family heirlooms. Mom felt uncomfortable about it, said it seemed like interrogation more than casual conversation." The word interrogation struck me as particularly significant. Patricia had grown up visiting Harold's house for family gatherings, spending summers helping Dorothy can vegetables and learning to fish from Harold's patient instruction. The idea that she would now interrogate elderly neighbors about Harold's private affairs suggested a fundamental shift in how she viewed family relationships, less about love and loss, more about asset recovery and financial opportunity. A second call to Tom Kroger at the hardware store revealed additional details about my cousin's investigative efforts. "Dennis stopped by yesterday afternoon," Tom told me. "Asked about Harold's recent purchases, wanted to know if Harold had mentioned anything about storage needs or valuable items requiring protection. Offered to pay for any information that might help the family understand Harold's final arrangements." The phrase "offered to pay" made my stomach turn. Dennis had been willing to compensate local business owners for information about Harold's private purchases and conversations. This wasn't family members trying to understand their uncle's final wishes. This was financial archaeology, systematic excavation designed to locate assets that might not be immediately obvious to casual observation. By noon, I'd assembled a disturbing picture of my cousin's activities over the past few days, banking inquiries that went beyond normal estate procedures, neighbor interviews that resembled interrogations more than grief-stricken family conversations, business owner consultations that included financial incentives for information sharing. They'd been conducting a professional-grade investigation into Harold's potential hidden assets, using resources and methods that suggested significant prior planning. The jar in Harold's cellar suddenly felt less like a personal inheritance and more like the focal point of a treasure hunt that had been underway since before Harold's funeral. His careful instructions about discretion and judgment weren't just suggestions about proper stewardship. They were warnings about family members who might see dollar signs where they should see legacy. Standing in Harold's living room, surrounded by photographs documenting 50 years of family gatherings and celebrations, I began to understand why Harold had chosen secrecy over transparency. He'd recognized something in Dennis and Patricia that I'd been too trusting to acknowledge. They'd evolved beyond family loyalty into something more calculating, more focused on financial opportunity than emotional connection. The estate sale professionals would arrive in 2 hours, armed with appraisal expertise and market knowledge that would reduce Harold's lifetime of careful accumulation to a series of price tags and lot numbers. But the real evaluation had already been completed by my cousins, who'd spent the past week systematically investigating Harold's affairs with the thoroughness of people convinced that significant wealth lay hidden somewhere in his modest home. Harold's trust in my judgment was beginning to feel less like honor and more like burden, a test that would require me to choose between family harmony and family integrity in ways I wasn't sure I was prepared to handle. The estate sale professionals arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, their white van emblazoned with Heritage Estate Solutions, Toledo, parked in Harold's driveway like a hearse waiting to collect the remnants of a life. Patricia had beaten them by 10 minutes, her BMW gleaming in the afternoon sun as she stood on Harold's front porch with the proprietary air of someone who'd already mentally divided the contents of the house into profitable lots. Dennis pulled up just as the appraisers were unloading their equipment, digital cameras, measuring devices, and tablet computers that would reduce Harold's 60 years of careful accumulation to market values and auction estimates. The lead appraiser, a thin man in his 50s named Carl Morrison, greeted my cousins with the practiced familiarity of someone who'd been recommended through their networks rather than selected through objective research. "Patricia mentioned you folks are looking for a complete evaluation," Morrison said, consulting notes on his tablet. She indicated there might be some higher value items that aren't immediately obvious to family members. "We specialize in finding those hidden gems that people sometimes overlook." The phrase "hidden gems" made my teeth clench as I watched Morrison's assistant begin photographing Harold's living room with systematic precision. These weren't people conducting respectful estate evaluations. They were treasure hunters equipped with professional credentials and market expertise, summoned by my cousins to locate whatever valuable items Harold might have accumulated or concealed during his lifetime. "Bobby's been handling the initial sorting," Dennis explained with that pharmaceutical sales smoothness that made every interaction feel like a managed transaction. "But we want to make sure nothing significant gets missed." Harold was quite the collector, and sometimes elderly people don't realize the current value of items they've had for decades. Again with the implications about Harold's mental capacity, as if his careful stewardship of family possessions somehow indicated cognitive decline rather than thoughtful preservation. I found myself bristling at the casual way Dennis reduced Harold's intentional decisions to symptoms of age-related confusion. Morrison's team worked through Harold's house with clinical efficiency, photographing furniture, examining china patterns, and evaluating everything from Dorothy's sewing machine to Harold's collection of Reader's Digest condensed books. They spent considerable time in the workshop, cataloging tools and equipment with particular attention to items that might have collector value or resale potential beyond their functional worth. "The workshop alone should bring $4,000 to $5,000, Morrison told Patricia, making notes on his tablet. "Quality tools from that era, well maintained, always have a market, and this pegboard organization suggests someone who took real pride in his equipment." Hearing Harold's lifelong respect for proper tool maintenance reduced to marketable nostalgia felt like watching strangers evaluate the monetary worth of a man's character. Those tools hadn't just been equipment, they'd been extensions of Harold's hands, witnesses to countless repair projects and creative endeavors that had nothing to do with resale value and everything to do with the satisfaction of work done properly. But it was when Morrison's assistant mentioned the basement that my anxiety spiked into genuine alarm. "We'll need to do a complete cellar evaluation," she told Patricia while making notes about Harold's dining room furniture. "Basements and attics are where people often store items they've forgotten about, old coins, stamps, jewelry, sometimes even precious metals that have been tucked away for decades." Patricia's immediate interest was unmistakable. Harold did spend time in the basement, especially in recent months. He claimed he was just organizing, but now that I think about it, he was quite secretive about whatever he was doing down there. The systematic way she'd observed and cataloged Harold's behavior during his final months struck me as deeply unsettling. How long had she been watching Harold with the calculating attention of someone assessing potential inheritance, rather than spending time with a beloved uncle facing his final illness? We should definitely do a thorough basement evaluation, Dennis agreed quickly. Sometimes the most valuable items are stored in the least obvious places. I excused myself to use Harold's bathroom, but really needed a moment to think clearly about what was happening. My cousins had summoned professional treasure hunters to systematically evaluate Harold's possessions, with particular focus on areas where valuable items might be concealed. They'd been planning this comprehensive asset search since before Harold's funeral, using the past week to gather intelligence about his potential hidden wealth. Standing in Harold's bathroom, surrounded by his simple toiletries and the clean towels Dorothy had folded with characteristic precision, I found myself facing a decision point I hadn't anticipated. In less than an hour, Morrison's team would examine the basement where Harold's jar waited behind Dorothy's preserved vegetables. Their professional expertise would certainly locate the dental gold, and once discovered, it would become part of the official estate inventory subject to legal division among heirs. Harold's instructions about discretion and judgment suddenly felt less like suggestions and more like urgent warnings about exactly this scenario. He'd understood that professional estate evaluation would reduce his carefully preserved family legacy to current market prices for precious metals, transforming 3 generations of dental gold into commodity assets rather than historical artifacts. Looking at myself in Harold's bathroom mirror, I recognized the expression I'd worn during union negotiations when management tried to railroad decisions past working people who deserved better treatment. That same combination of determination and barely controlled anger was building in my chest as I realized what my cousins were attempting to accomplish through their systematic asset investigation. Harold had trusted me with knowledge about his hidden inheritance, specifically because he'd recognized something in Dennis and Patricia that I'd been too family loyal to acknowledge. They'd evolved beyond grief and loss into something more calculating, more focused on financial recovery than emotional connection or historical preservation. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. I could allow Morrison's team to discover the dental gold, watch it get reduced to current market values and divided among heirs who saw precious metal rather than family history. Or I could honor Harold's trust in my judgment by ensuring that his carefully preserved legacy ended up with someone who understood its significance beyond monetary worth. Harold's note had been specific about conditions and wisdom, about using judgment rather than following legal procedures that might not serve the inheritance's true purpose. Standing in his bathroom while professional appraisers cataloged his possessions in preparation for conversion to cash, I realized that Harold's real gift hadn't been gold at all. It had been the much more difficult responsibility of distinguishing between family members who would preserve legacy and family members who would liquidate it. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs told me Morrison's assistant was beginning her cellar evaluation. In a few minutes, she would work her way through Dorothy's preserved vegetables toward the back shelves where Harold's jar waited behind the failed pickled beets. I had perhaps 10 minutes to decide whether Harold's trust in my judgment meant more than my desire to maintain family harmony, whether legacy preservation justified secrecy from family members who might not understand the difference between inheritance and commodity acquisition. The sound of Morrison's assistant climbing the basement stairs with deliberate purpose made my decision for me. I intercepted her at the kitchen door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Find anything interesting down there?" I asked with forced casualness, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. She consulted her tablet with professional efficiency. "Mostly standard basement storage, lots of preserved foods. Your uncle's wife was quite the canner, but there's one section behind the older jars that we haven't fully examined yet. Sometimes people store valuable items in areas they think are too inconvenient for casual discovery." Through the kitchen window, I could see Dennis and Patricia consulting with Morrison near his van, their heads bent over his preliminary assessment forms like executives reviewing quarterly projections. The afternoon light caught Patricia's jewelry as she gestured toward the house, and I realized with crystalline clarity that they weren't grieving family members anymore. They were investors calculating return on emotional investment, appraising Harold's lifetime of careful accumulation for its conversion potential to cash. "Actually," I said to Morrison's assistant, my union negotiation training kicking in with the smooth authority I'd learned during 25 years of advocating for workers' rights, "there's something I need to address with the family before we continue the basement evaluation." She looked confused but professional. "Of course, we'll wait for your signal." I walked outside where Dennis and Patricia were reviewing Morrison's preliminary numbers with the focused attention of people who'd been anticipating this moment since Harold's death. The September afternoon had grown cooler, and the quality of light carried that particular autumn melancholy that makes ordinary moments feel weighted with significance. "We need to talk," I said quietly, my voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that makes people pay attention. "About Harold's intentions for certain items that aren't included in standard estate procedures." Dennis looked up from Morrison's tablet with sharp interest. "What kind of items, Bobby?" Patricia stepped closer, her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of fallen leaves and Harold's lingering pipe tobacco. "Did you find something valuable?" We knew Harold was hiding assets. His banking activities made that obvious. The casual way she admitted to investigating Harold's private financial affairs confirmed what I'd already suspected. This wasn't about grief or family connection. It was about asset recovery, systematic extraction of wealth they'd convinced themselves Harold owed them through family obligation. "Harold left specific instructions about certain family items," I said carefully, watching their expressions shift from polite attention to calculating focus. "Items with sentimental value that he wanted handled according to his personal wishes rather than legal requirements." "What specific items?" Dennis pressed, his pharmaceutical sales training evident in the way he leaned forward slightly, establishing dominance through physical positioning. "If Harold had valuable possessions, they need to be included in the estate inventory for proper tax documentation." I took a deep breath, thinking about Harold's note and his warning that the others would see dollar signs. Standing in his driveway, facing two people who'd systematically investigated his private affairs while claiming family concern, I realized that Harold's gift had been more than dental gold. It had been a test of whether I understood the difference between legal obligations and moral responsibilities. "Harold collected dental gold," I said simply. 3 generations of family dental work, including his own. It's stored in the basement, worth approximately $12,000 at current precious metal prices. The silence that followed felt dense as winter fog. Dennis and Patricia exchanged glances that confirmed they'd been searching for exactly this kind of hidden asset, though the specific nature of the inheritance clearly surprised them. "Dental gold?" Patricia repeated, her voice carrying a mixture of fascination and disgust. "You mean like extracted teeth?" "Gold crowns, bridges, partial dentures," I explained, watching their expressions process the unexpected nature of Harold's carefully preserved inheritance. Harold's grandfather started the collection during the Depression, when gold was gold regardless of its source. Harold added his own dental work over the years, treating it as a family legacy rather than medical waste. Dennis recovered first, his business instincts automatically calculating market implications. $12,000 is significant money, Bobby. That changes the estate valuation considerably. We'll need professional appraisal to determine exact precious metal content and current market value. Harold's instructions were specific about discretion and judgment, I said firmly, pulling his handwritten note from my jacket pocket. He trusted me to handle this inheritance according to family wisdom, rather than legal procedures. Patricia reached for the note with manicured fingers, but I held it back. Her movement had been automatic, proprietary, as if Harold's final wishes were subject to her approval rather than my stewardship. "Bobby," Dennis said with practiced patience, "I understand you want to honor Harold's wishes, but hiding assets from estate inventory is illegal. That gold needs to be professionally appraised and properly divided according to Ohio inheritance law." The word hiding struck me like a physical blow. I wasn't hiding anything. I was preserving Harold's carefully thought-out decision about appropriate stewardship of family legacy. The distinction between concealment and discretion apparently didn't register with people who'd reduced Harold's final months to systematic asset investigation. "Harold understood the legal requirements," I said, my voice gaining strength from union meeting experience, advocating for principles against financial pressure. "He chose family wisdom over legal automation. This gold represents 3 generations of Depression-era resourcefulness, not just current precious metal prices." Patricia's expression hardened with the particular frustration of someone whose careful planning had encountered unexpected resistance. "Family wisdom doesn't override inheritance law, Bobby. Harold might have been sentimental about dental work, but we have legal obligations to properly distribute estate assets. The casual way she dismissed Harold's sentimentality as irrelevant to proper asset distribution confirmed everything Harold had predicted about their approach to family legacy. They saw precious metal where Harold had preserved family history, commodity value where he'd maintained generational continuity. Morrison approached from his van, sensing tension but maintaining professional neutrality. Is there some issue with the basement evaluation? We can certainly accommodate family discussions about sensitive items. There's no issue, Dennis said quickly, his pharmaceutical sales training automatically taking control of the situation. We've identified some additional assets that need professional evaluation. Please proceed with your complete basement assessment. No, I said firmly, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. The basement evaluation stops here. Harold entrusted me with specific responsibilities that don't include conversion to current market prices. The confrontation had crystallized into something I hadn't anticipated, a direct challenge to my cousin's assumption that legal procedures automatically superseded Harold's personal wishes about family legacy preservation. Standing in Harold's driveway, surrounded by the life he'd built through 60 years of honest work and careful stewardship, I realized that his trust in my judgment meant more than maintaining family harmony with people who'd investigated his private affairs like potential fraud investigators. Dennis pulled out his phone with the controlled aggression of someone preparing to escalate beyond family negotiation. I think we need legal consultation about this situation, Bobby. Harold's personal wishes don't override state inheritance requirements. As he started dialing, I understood that Harold's gift had been more complex than precious metal or family history. It had been the much more difficult responsibility of choosing between people who would preserve legacy and people who would liquidate it for immediate financial benefit. Dennis's call to his attorney lasted 12 minutes, during which Patricia paced Harold's driveway like a caged animal, while Morrison and his assistant waited by their van with the patient professionalism of people accustomed to family disputes over valuable discoveries. I stood on Harold's front porch, watching the afternoon light shift across the maple trees he'd planted 30 years ago, and felt the weight of his trust settling around me like a mantle I hadn't asked to wear but couldn't honorably refuse. When Dennis finished his call, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who'd confirmed his legal position. According to my attorney, concealing estate assets constitutes fraud under Ohio law, regardless of the deceased's personal wishes. That dental gold needs to be professionally appraised and included in the official estate inventory within 72 hours, or will be forced to file a complaint with the probate court. The threat hung in the September air like smoke from Harold's old pipe, and I realized we'd crossed some invisible line between family disagreement and legal warfare. Patricia joined Dennis with the unified front of people who'd decided that financial considerations outweighed emotional loyalty, their expensive clothes and calculating expressions making them look like strangers wearing the faces of relatives I'd known since childhood. Harold specifically warned me about this, I said, pulling out his handwritten note and reading aloud with deliberate emphasis. He wrote, "The others would see dollar signs. You'll see what it really is. A legacy that shouldn't be squandered. Use your judgment." And he understood exactly how you'd respond to news about the dental gold. Harold wasn't thinking clearly during his final months, Patricia said, with the casual cruelty of someone who'd decided that inconvenient truths could be dismissed as symptoms of cognitive decline. Hoarding extracted teeth isn't normal behavior, Bobby. It's evidence of the kind of confused thinking that invalidates his judgment about proper asset distribution. Her words struck me like physical blows, reducing Harold's careful preservation of family history to pathological behavior that could be legally challenged. The man who'd maintained his mental sharpness through crossword puzzles and technical reading right up until his final hospitalization was being retrospectively diagnosed with incompetence by family members who'd systematically investigated his private affairs while claiming concern for his welfare. "There's more," I said, my voice gaining strength from the kind of anger that burns cold and steady. Harold's research into family genealogy wasn't just casual interest in ancestry. He'd been documenting the complete history of this dental gold collection, tracing it back to his grandfather's railroad work during the Depression. I walked to my truck and retrieved the manila folder I'd discovered that morning in Harold's desk drawer, the one I'd been saving for a moment exactly like this. Harold's methodical research filled 40 pages of handwritten notes, photocopied documents, and family photographs that told the complete story of 3 generations of dental gold preservation. Harold's grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad from 1923 until 1951, I read from Harold's careful documentation. During the Depression, when banks were failing and currency became worthless, Thomas had his dental work done by a dentist who accepted payment in labor and produce. But Thomas insisted on keeping the extracted gold teeth, understanding that precious metal retained value regardless of economic conditions. Dennis and Patricia listened with the forced attention of people trapped in a presentation they'd rather escape, but Harold's research was thorough enough to command respect even from hostile audiences. Thomas passed the collection to Harold's father, William, who added his own dental work during the 1940s and 1950s. William understood that the gold represented more than metal. It was tangible proof of family resourcefulness, Depression-era wisdom that understood survival required preserving value in forms that couldn't be stolen or devalued by economic collapse. Patricia shifted uncomfortably, her expensive jewelry catching the afternoon light as she recognized the implicit criticism of her own relationship with material wealth. Harold's family had preserved precious metal through 3 generations of economic uncertainty, while she'd accumulated luxury items that required constant maintenance of artificial social status. Harold added his own dental work to the collection starting in 1978, I continued, reading from his meticulous documentation. Each crown, bridge, and partial denture represented not just medical necessity, but conscious participation in family tradition. He researched current precious metal prices regularly, documenting the collection's increasing value while maintaining its historical integrity. The professional appraisal Harold had commissioned 6 months before his death valued the complete collection at $11,800 based on gold content and current market prices, but his notes included something more significant: detailed instructions about appropriate stewardship that went far beyond monetary considerations. Harold wrote, "This collection represents practical wisdom that sustained our family through the worst economic disaster in American history. It should go to someone who understands that security comes from preparation and character, not from luck or inheritance. Dennis and Patricia have never learned the difference between wealth and wisdom. Bobby understands that some gifts come with responsibilities that outlast the giver." Dennis's pharmaceutical sales composure finally cracked. Harold had no right to make unilateral decisions about family assets based on his personal judgments about our character. That gold belongs to all 3 heirs equally, regardless of his sentimental attachment to Depression-era paranoia. "It wasn't paranoia," I said firmly, my union meeting experience helping me maintain control while delivering uncomfortable truths. "Harold watched both of you spend the past week systematically investigating his private affairs, interviewing neighbors, bribing business owners for information, and hiring professional treasure hunters to locate hidden assets. He predicted exactly this behavior in his final notes." Patricia's face flushed with the particular anger of someone whose careful planning had been exposed as calculated rather than compassionate. "We were trying to ensure proper estate settlement. Harold's secretive behavior suggested he might have valuable items that needed professional evaluation." "Harold's secretive behavior was actually careful stewardship of family legacy," I replied, reading from another section of his research. "He spent his final months documenting the complete history of this collection because he understood that its real value lay in the wisdom it represented, not just its precious metal content." Morrison approached from his van, clearly uncomfortable with the family conflict that had erupted around his professional services. "Perhaps we should postpone the complete evaluation until family legal issues are resolved," he suggested diplomatically. "No postponement necessary," Dennis said with renewed authority, his attorney's advice apparently providing confidence about legal options. "That dental gold gets professionally appraised today, or we file fraud complaints tomorrow. Bobby can honor Harold's memory without breaking inheritance law." The ultimatum crystallized everything Harold had predicted about his niece and nephew's approach to family legacy. They were prepared to pursue legal action against their own cousin rather than respect Harold's careful decisions about appropriate stewardship of Depression-era wisdom preserved across 3 generations. Standing in Harold's driveway, surrounded by the life he'd built through honest work and thoughtful preparation, I realized that his real gift hadn't been gold at all. It had been the much more difficult responsibility of distinguishing between family members who would preserve legacy and family members who would liquidate it for immediate financial gratification. Harold's trust in my judgment was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether 3 generations of careful preservation would continue or be converted to current market prices by people who saw commodity value where they should have recognized historical wisdom. The legal consultation Dennis demanded took place the following Tuesday at the offices of Crawford & Associates in downtown Lima, a sterile conference room that smelled of leather briefcases and old coffee. Dennis and Patricia arrived with their attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Margaret Crawford, who specialized in estate disputes and carried herself with the predatory confidence of someone who'd built her career on family conflicts over money. I brought Harold's complete documentation and my own attorney, Ed Kowalski, Jerry's uncle, who'd handled union contract negotiations for 30 years before transitioning to elder law. Ed understood the difference between legal requirements and family wisdom, having spent decades advocating for working people against corporate attorneys who reduced human dignity to contractual obligations. "The facts are straightforward," Crawford began, consulting her tablet with clinical precision. "Ohio inheritance law requires full disclosure and proper distribution of all estate assets, regardless of the deceased's personal preferences about specific items. Concealing valuable property constitutes willful interference with estate administration." Ed responded with the patient authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades protecting people from legal intimidation. "The facts are that Harold Mitchell made specific provisions for certain family items based on his documented research into their historical significance. These provisions don't violate inheritance law. They represent thoughtful stewardship decisions that any competent adult has the right to make regarding personal property." The battle lines were drawn with uncomfortable clarity. Crawford represented legal automation, the reduction of Harold's carefully considered decisions to standardized procedures that prioritized financial efficiency over personal wisdom. Ed represented Harold's right to make meaningful choices about family legacy preservation based on 3 generations of documented history. Crawford pulled out photocopied bank statements that made my stomach tighten. Mr. Mitchell's regular cash withdrawals during his final months suggest systematic concealment of assets from potential estate inventory. His inquiries about precious metal storage and insurance indicate deliberate preparation for hiding valuable items from legal heirs. Or, Ed countered smoothly, they indicate a thoughtful man making careful preparations to ensure important family items received appropriate care and ended up with family members capable of understanding their significance beyond current market prices. The meeting lasted 2 hours, during which Crawford systematically presented evidence of Harold's suspicious financial activities, while Ed methodically documented Harold's extensive genealogical research and detailed instructions about legacy preservation. The contrast was stark. Crawford saw criminal concealment where Ed recognized responsible stewardship. But the turning point came when Ed produced Harold's complete medical records from his final 6 months, documents I'd obtained through my healthcare proxy authority. The records painted a picture of a man whose cognitive function remained sharp even as his physical health deteriorated. Someone capable of making complex decisions about family legacy right up until his final hospitalization. Harold Mitchell completed extensive genealogical research during his final months, Ed explained, spreading Harold's documented family history across the conference table. He traced the dental gold collection through 3 generations, documented its historical significance, and made thoughtful decisions about appropriate stewardship based on detailed knowledge of family members' values and character. Crawford's expression tightened as she realized Harold's mental competency couldn't be legally challenged. Competency doesn't override inheritance law. That dental gold still needs to be appraised and properly distributed according to legal requirements. "Which brings us to the real issue," Ed said with the timing of someone who'd spent decades building toward crucial moments in complex negotiations. Harold Mitchell didn't hide assets from legal heirs. He made a gift of personal property to a specific family member based on documented research into that person's character and values. The gift documentation Ed produced from Harold's papers was legally unassailable. Harold had formally transferred ownership of the dental gold collection to me 6 months before his death, complete with proper notarization and witness signatures. The transfer was documented as a gift between family members, with appropriate tax implications handled through Harold's annual gift exemption allowances. Dennis and Patricia stared at the legal documents with expressions of shock and growing rage. Harold hadn't just preserved his family legacy from their liquidation plans. He'd outsmarted their systematic asset investigation by completing the transfer months before his death, rendering their current legal arguments completely irrelevant. "This changes nothing," Dennis said with the controlled fury of someone whose careful planning had been completely outmaneuvered. "Bobby still has moral obligations to share Harold's gifts with other family members." "Moral obligations aren't legal requirements," Ed replied calmly. Harold Mitchell had the right to distribute his personal property according to his own judgment about appropriate recipients. Those decisions were made while he was fully competent, properly documented, and legally executed. Crawford spent another hour reviewing the gift documentation, looking for technical flaws that might invalidate Harold's transfer. But Harold had been as methodical about legal requirements as he'd been about everything else in his life, working with Ed's firm to ensure his decisions would withstand exactly the kind of challenge Dennis and Patricia were now mounting. The meeting ended with uncomfortable handshakes and the professional courtesy that barely concealed deep family wounds. Dennis and Patricia left with their attorney, their expressions carrying the particular fury of people whose systematic planning had been defeated by superior preparation and deeper understanding of both legal requirements and family character. That evening, I sat in Harold's kitchen for what I knew would be the last time, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells that had defined his life for 38 years. The dental gold collection waited on the kitchen table where Dorothy had once rolled pie dough and Harold had once helped grandchildren with homework. 3 generations of family wisdom preserved in forms that most people would find repugnant, but that represented genuine security to anyone who understood Depression-era resourcefulness. The phone rang with expected regularity over the following weeks. Dennis called with alternating threats and attempts at emotional manipulation, suggesting that family harmony required me to ignore Harold's documented wishes and share his gifts according to their financial expectations. Patricia tried a different approach, emphasizing the unfairness of Harold's decision and implying that my refusal to redistribute his gifts represented betrayal of family values. Both approaches missed the fundamental point Harold had understood with crystalline clarity. The dental gold wasn't really about precious metal or current market values. It was about the wisdom to distinguish between family members who would preserve legacy and family members who would convert it to immediate financial gratification. 6 months later, I moved from Lima to a small town in southern Ohio, where Harold's legacy helped me purchase a modest house with enough land for a garden and workshop. The dental gold remained exactly what Harold had intended it to be, not wealth for consumption, but security for preparation, practical wisdom that understood the difference between having money and understanding value. My relationship with Dennis and Patricia never recovered, though I occasionally heard updates through other family members. Dennis's pharmaceutical sales territory was eventually downsized during industry consolidation, forcing him to accept lower commissions and reduced benefits. Patricia's husband's real estate development company struggled through the economic uncertainties that followed 2024, requiring them to sell their vacation properties and downsize their country club lifestyle. Harold's gifts had sustained me through economic pressures that challenged their assumptions about financial security based on careers rather than character. The old man's Depression-era wisdom proved more durable than their modern approaches to wealth accumulation, though I doubted they would ever acknowledge the lesson their uncle had tried to teach through his careful stewardship of family legacy. 3 years have passed since Harold's funeral, and I'm writing this story from the kitchen of my small farmhouse in Vinton County, Ohio, where morning light filters through windows that look out over vegetable gardens Harold would have recognized and approved. The dental gold that caused so much family conflict now rests in a safety deposit box at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in MacArthur, still worth approximately $12,000, but representing something far more valuable. The hard-earned wisdom that security comes from preparation and character, not from luck or inheritance. The intervening years have validated Harold's judgment in ways I couldn't have anticipated during that September afternoon when Dennis and Patricia hired professional appraisers to systematically evaluate his lifetime of careful accumulation. Economic uncertainties that followed the 2024 election created exactly the kind of instability that Depression-era wisdom was designed to weather, while modern approaches to wealth management struggled with market volatility and industry consolidation that Harold's generation would have recognized as predictable cycles rather than unprecedented crises. Dennis's pharmaceutical career never recovered from the industry downsizing that eliminated his territory and reduced his income by 60%. The expensive lifestyle that had required constant commission growth couldn't adapt to reduced circumstances, forcing him to sell his Lexus, downsize his housing, and accept a position with a regional medical supply company at a fraction of his previous earnings. Pride prevented him from acknowledging the irony, but Harold's modest pension and Social Security benefits were providing more stable income than Dennis's commission-based career could deliver during economic uncertainty. Patricia's situation proved even more instructive. Her husband's real estate development company filed for bankruptcy when construction loans became impossible to secure and luxury home markets collapsed under economic pressure. The country club memberships, private school tuitions, and vacation properties that had defined their social status disappeared with shocking speed, leaving them with the kind of financial vulnerability that Harold's generation understood as the natural consequence of building security on appearances rather than substance. Their children, Harold's great-nieces and great-nephews, bore the brunt of these adjustments. College plans changed from prestigious private universities to community colleges and state schools. Summer camps and enrichment programs disappeared along with the family's discretionary income. The grandchildren Harold had quietly slipped $20 bills now learned about economic reality through their parents' financial stress rather than their great-uncle's gentle instruction about the difference between wants and needs. I found myself thinking about Harold's wisdom during my own transition from factory pension to rural self-sufficiency. The dental gold provided exactly the kind of flexible security he'd intended, not wealth for consumption, but resources for adaptation, enabling me to purchase tools and equipment that would reduce my dependence on volatile economic systems that had failed Dennis and Patricia so spectacularly. My garden produces enough vegetables for canning and preservation, skills I learned from watching Dorothy during childhood visits that seemed purely social at the time, but now provided practical knowledge about food security. The workshop Harold would have recognized houses the tools that enable me to maintain my property and solve problems through craftsmanship rather than cash payments to service professionals whose rates increased faster than fixed incomes could accommodate. The wisdom embedded in 3 generations of dental gold preservation revealed itself through daily applications rather than abstract principles. Harold's grandfather had understood that precious metal retained value regardless of economic conditions because it represented tangible wealth that couldn't be devalued by currency manipulation or eliminated by bank failures. Harold's father had continued the collection because Depression-era experience had taught him that security required diverse forms of value storage rather than dependence on single financial institutions or economic systems. Harold himself had maintained the collection while adding his own dental work because he'd witnessed the plant closures and pension failures that taught his generation never to assume that corporate promises would survive economic pressures. The careful documentation he'd maintained about precious metal prices represented not obsessive behavior but practical monitoring of asset values that might need to be accessed during emergencies that Social Security and pension benefits couldn't handle. The family relationships that had been damaged by conflict over Harold's legacy settled into patterns I hadn't expected. Dennis and Patricia's children began calling me occasionally, asking questions about their great-uncle's life and values that their parents had dismissed as irrelevant to modern success. These young people, facing economic realities their parents hadn't prepared them to handle, seemed genuinely interested in understanding the practical wisdom that had sustained Harold through 60 years of honest work and thoughtful preparation. My conversations with Harold's great-grandchildren revealed how completely Dennis and Patricia had misunderstood their uncle's approach to financial security. They'd seen his modest lifestyle as evidence of limited ambition rather than conscious choice, his careful spending as symptoms of Depression-era anxiety rather than practical wisdom about distinguishing between needs and wants. The economic pressures that had forced their own lifestyle adjustments were teaching them lessons Harold could have shared if anyone had been interested in learning from his experience rather than inheriting his assets. The dental gold collection remains exactly what Harold intended it to be. Not an investment for growth, but insurance against uncertainty. Practical security that doesn't depend on market performance or corporate stability. Its value hasn't increased dramatically, but its purchasing power has remained stable, while other forms of wealth have fluctuated with economic conditions that Harold's generation would have recognized as normal rather than catastrophic. Standing in my kitchen on autumn mornings when the light carries the same golden quality I remember from Harold's house, I understand that his real gift wasn't precious metal at all. It was the much more valuable legacy of learning to distinguish between security and prosperity. between wisdom and cleverness, between family members who would preserve values and family members who would liquidate them for immediate gratification. The jar that caused so much family conflict 3 years ago now represents something Harold always understood but could never have explained to people who measured success through consumption rather than character. True inheritance isn't about what you accumulate during your lifetime. It's about what you understand well enough to pass on to people capable of preserving its meaning for future generations, who will face their own economic uncertainties with whatever wisdom their ancestors had the foresight to preserve. Harold's legacy lives on, not in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the practical knowledge that security comes from preparation, character, and the wisdom to recognize that some gifts come with responsibilities that outlast both the giver and the recipient. The dental gold remains safely preserved, waiting to provide the same flexible security for future generations that Harold's grandfather had understood during the Depression and Harold himself had maintained through 4 decades of honest work. Some inheritances can't be divided equally because their true value lies not in current market prices, but in the wisdom required to preserve their meaning across generations that will face their own tests of character and judgment. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about family wisdom versus family wealth in the comments below. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.